Augurs of Spring marks a radical shift from the introduction to Part 1. Dramatically, we shift from the pastoral to the military mode, from the natural world, with no dancers on stage, to the human world, populated first by male and then by male and female dancers, from night to day. Musically, we shift from tempo rubato to tempo giusto, from solo winds to massed strings played percussively, and eventually the whole band, and from a dark haze to bright clarity. The scene is in 3 large sections. In the first section, the old woman teaches divination to the young men. The harmonic orientation is toward E-flat, B-flat, but with strongly dissonant countervailing pressure from E-B, and with intermittent presence of C-G. I will call this section Dances of the Young Men with the Old Woman. Amid the regular march-like meter, punctuated with irregular accents, the expressive mode is military. In the second section, to which the scene's subtitle, Dances of the Young Women, properly applies, the pounding chords cease and the young women enter with their own distinctive tunes and ostinato figures. Although the prevailing expressive mode is still military, the entrance of the young women brings elements of the feminized pastoral from the introduction to Part 1. The harmonic orientation is balanced between E-flat, B-flat, and C-G. The dissonant E-B has fallen away. In the final section, which I will call Dances of the Young People, the music accumulates layers even as it thins harmonically to an exclusive focus on E-flat, B-flat, and moves to a cacophonous climax, leading directly to the riotous ritual of abduction scene that follows. This first section of the scene features the steady pulsation, punctuated by irregular accents, of a loud, dissonant, percussive 8-note chord known as the Augurs chord. Metrically, this section is in a steady 2-4, often grouped into 4-measure phrases, in the tempo of a fast march. The expressive mode is military, and the section is dominated by the young men as they learn divination from the old woman. As Stravinsky described the scene, some adolescent boys appear with a very old woman, whose age and even whose century is unknown, who knows the secrets of nature and teaches her sons prediction. She runs bent over the earth, half woman, half beast. The boys at her side are augurs of spring, who mark in their steps the rhythm of spring, the pulse beat of spring. The beginning of this scene plunges us right into the military mode, a strict metronomic succession of 8th notes punctuated by irregularly spaced accents, in the manner of a march and in strict march tempo, a percussive timbre with the massed strings playing repeated down bows punctuated by massed brass, a low register with the notes closely spaced. We hear a harmony layer only. The repeated chords are grouped in measures of 2-4, arranged as an 8-measure phrase, perfectly duple at every level. The 8 notes of this Augurs chord are clearly divided into 2 distinct components, an E major triad below, and an E-flat dominant 7th chord above. The low register of the chord and its close packed arrangement add to the dissonant noisiness of the combination. At this point, the 2 triads seem equally strong, but it will turn out that the locus of musical activity throughout the scene takes place within the E-flat, B-flat frame, often mixed with C-oriented harmonies. The E major triad is a secondary distractor, and eventually fades out of the picture. The E major triad was a prominent harmony in the introduction to Part 1. There it was used to harmonize the old woman's melody as well as the various nature melodies. In Augurs, when the old woman is on the stage, we hear the E major triad as the lower component of the Augurs chord. When she leaves the stage, the E major triad leaves also. The E major triad functions as both a harmonic link to the previous scene and as a harmonic emblem of the old woman. But E flat major is the principal harmony of Augurs. In that light, we can understand the Augurs chord as a consonant triad, E flat major, with a dissonant distractor, E natural, positioned in the bass. This creates a familiar 6 plus 5 equals 11 registral arrangement. The pounding chords of Block 1, lasting for 8 measures, are answered by the more delicate arpeggiations of Block 2, lasting for 4 measures. At the top of the texture is a 4-note figure that will run as an ostinato through virtually the entire scene. It arpeggiates the upper 3 notes of the E flat major chord from Block 1, B flat, D flat, E flat. It begins with a descending minor third, D flat, B flat, and is framed by that same interval from its first note to its last. It describes the trichord type 0-3-5, which we have learned to think of as an incomplete Dorian tetrachord. This motto ostinato has strong resonance with 2 tunes from the introduction to Part 1, including the ballet's opening melody. The motivic transformations both create a musical link to the earlier scene and measure the significant expressive distance the music has traversed, from a focus on the natural world in pastoral mode to a focus on the young men of the tribe in military mode. Compared to the opening folk tune, the motto ostinato is a semitone higher. Compared to nature melody number 3, the motto ostinato is both transposed and has the same intervals in reverse order. Beneath the 4-note ostinato, 3 different triads are arpeggiated. In the cellos, moving in 8th notes, E major alternates with C major. The E major is also the lower component of the 8-note chord in Block 1. In the bassoon, moving twice as quickly in 16th notes, C major alternates with E minor. E flat major and E major, the components of the Augurs chord, have no notes in common. The arpeggiated C major and E minor triads share tones with each other and with the components of the Augurs chord, binding these 4 triads together. In the harmony layer of Block 3, we hear the 8-note Augurs chord and the 4-note motto ostinato continuing from previous blocks. Above the harmony layer, with its Augurs chord and its 4-note ostinato, we hear the first melody of the scene. In the score and in his letters, Stravinsky identifies this melody with an old woman, a seer and a diviner, half woman, half beast. Quote, I see her running in front of the group, stopping them sometimes and interrupting the rhythmic flow. The melody is in 2 parts, an ascending 3-note head motive and a much longer descending chromatic continuation. The head motive is derived from a recurring nature tune at the same pitch level in the introduction. The association emphasizes the old woman's affinity with the natural world. She is half beast. The continuation of the old woman's melody is a transposed repetition of a tune we heard many times in the introduction, one based on descending minor thirds within a 0-3-3-6 frame. We identified those tunes as premonitions of the old woman. Here it is identified explicitly with her as her leitmotif. Its descending thirds enmesh it in a large-scale descending 3 cycle that begins in the introduction and extends into augurs, including the 4-note motto ostinato. In the process, it connects the first premonitory statement of this leitmotif with its definitive statement at the same pitch level. Just as the old woman is different from the crowd of young men she dances with, she's an old, female, supernatural figure, the prevailing meter shifts from duple to triple at her entrance. There is no general association of triple hypermeter with particular characters or expressive modes, but in this instance, the musical differentiation of the young men and the old woman is underscored by their contrasting hypermeter. The young men are duple, the old woman is triple. In block 4, a 12-measure block, the textural strands start to proliferate, with 3 distinct ostinatos in the harmony layer. Of the 3 ostinatos, 2 are oriented toward E-flat, B-flat, and 1 toward C-G. The upper 2 ostinatos are comfortably duple, but the lowest ostinato is inherently triple. It lasts for 3, not 2 quarter notes, and coincides with the notated downbeats every 3 measures. The hypermeter is also triple and divides the 12-measure phrase into 4 groups of 3. If triple hypermeter, like a melody based on 0-3-6, is characteristic of the old woman, we can say that she is still in charge of the scene. Over this 3-tiered harmony layer, we hear brief brass fanfares in stacked perfect fifths. These fanfares reinforce the orientation of the scene toward the military expressive mode. They verticalize the stack of fifths implicit in the lowest ostinato and extend it upward. One might imagine the whole stack is grounded on E-flat, or perhaps the upper portion of the stack takes on a C-G orientation. If so, the stack of fifths would embody the juxtaposition of E-flat and C, felt also in the ostinato. The main tune for this block traces a Dorian tetrachord, G, A, B flat, C, and thus moves within a C-G frame. I identify this as the young men's melody as they learn divination. It features the descending minor third, C-A, and thus recalls the opening folk tune of the ballet, where the same motive was found within a different form of 0235. In general, the human characters, young men and young women, are associated with 0235-based melodies, especially those that involve no accidentals, like A, B, C, D, or D, E, F, G, or just B flat, like G, A, B flat, C. Block 5 is an exact repeat of Block 1, down to the placement of the accents. Block 5 marks a return to duple hypermeter after the disruptions caused by the old woman's triple hypermeter. In Block 6, the 8-note chords continue to pound away in steady eighth notes in regular 2/4 meter with irregular accents. In the same low register, we hear a new tune based like so many others on the Dorian tetrachord and featuring a descending minor third. The Dorian tetrachord tells us we are dealing with human characters, and the low register, marcato articulation, and rhythmic regularity tell us we are dealing with young men in a military expressive mode. It is the young men's melody at a different transposition level. The melody trots up and down within its 4-note frame, mostly articulating regular 4-measure groups. This melody, associated with young men, is linked to the old woman's tune in 3 ways. First, its descending minor third lies within the descending 3 cycle previously traversed by both the 4-note motto ostinato and the old woman's tune. Second, The young men's tune lies at the same pitch location as the head motive of the old woman's tune. Finally, the two tunes are linked through their minor thirds, one shared and the other a semitone apart. In all of these ways, subtle affinities bind these tunes despite their obvious musical and dramatic differences. The dramatic situation here involves interplay between the old women and the young men. She teaches them divination. They respond to her teaching. Hodson, in her reconstruction of Nijinsky's choreography, refers to this dramatic moment as the, quote, conversation, and arranges it as, quote, a series of gestural exchanges between the old woman of 300 years and the men whom she teaches how to jump and how to divine with twigs. This relationship between the old woman's melody, specifically its head motive, and the young men's melody is the musical equivalent of this choreographic interplay. Block 7 is basically a repeat of Block 6, but with the melody in strict canon at the double octave and at a distance of 2 measures. After the third measure, the canon produces only consonant intervals between the parts, octaves, thirds, and sixths. The two voices have different hypermetric schemes, and these contradict each other. In addition, the leading voice has been altered from its previous appearance in Block 5, and its internal hypermeter is now also full of conflicts. Block 8 is a brief interjection, a momentary suspension of the steady, relentless pulsation of the previous blocks. Formally, it closes off the first section of the scene, and the cessation of motion gives the measures a cadential, or at least interruptive, feel. This block consists of a somewhat fragmented statements of 3 different triads or seventh chords, an upper component on F-sharp 7, a lower component on C minor, and a concluding chord that suggests a combination of D minor and D major. C-centered harmonies have been and will remain prominent throughout the scene. The combination of harmonies whose roots are related by tritone, like F-sharp 7 and C minor, has not been a feature of the piece so far, but will become central in later scenes, especially the ritual of abduction. In the second large section of the scene, the steady rhythmic pulsation resumes after the cadential break in Block 8, as does the 4-note motto ostinato. But the pounding dissonant augurs chord and brass fanfares are gone, never to return. The first section was dominated by the young men and the military mode in which they operate. It was effectively a dance of the young men with interjections from the old woman. In the second section, the young women enter, and while the music never entirely shifts out of military mode, we are entering a somewhat quieter and gentler women's world. The melodies become more lyrical, their register higher, their articulations more legato. After one more brief statement of her characteristic melody, the old woman exits the stage, never to return. This section is the beginning of the dances of the young women, referenced in the subtitle of this scene. Block 9 has a harmony layer only, laying the groundwork for the more lyrical melodies we will shortly encounter. E major-oriented harmonies, especially as a dissonant distractor in the pounding Augurs chords, have vanished from the scene. The harmonic world is now divided between elements oriented towards E flat, B flat, especially the four-note motto, and elements oriented towards C, G. Here are the C-oriented components. As in Block 9, the harmony layer of Block 10 has components oriented towards E flat, B flat, especially the four-note motto, and towards C, G. The C-G layer involves the C-D trill from the previous block, now expanded into a full diatonic hexachord by the addition of an E-F tremolo and a slower alternation of G-A, which anticipates the first two notes of the young women's melody. The appearance of the young women's melody, their signature tune, anticipates their actual arrival on stage in the subsequent block. It moves within a G, A, B flat, C Dorian tetrachord with F as lower neighbor. Within its G, A, B flat, C frame, the melody features the descending melodic minor third from B flat to G. The melody is 8 measures long, divided into two 4-measure groups within a simple regular duple hypermeter. The young women's melody bears strong affinities with other melodies, most obviously the first statement of the young men's melody. They move in different ways through the same melodic frame, G, A, B flat, C. The musical affinity reinforces the dramatic affinity. These are two groups of young people. The young women's melody can also be thought of as a transposition of the four-note motto by a descending minor third. That's the motivic interval at a different level of structure. The young women's melody shares a descending minor third, B flat G, with the transposed young men's tune, and both of these melodies participate in a 3-cycle that has extended through the scene so far, embracing also the four-note motto and the old woman's tune. The 3-cycle thus binds together melodies of divergent musical content, expressive impact, and dramatic significance. The young women's melody also bears a striking family resemblance to the opening tune of the introduction, a descending minor third extended to a Dorian tetrachord by an upper neighbor and further embellished by a lower neighbor. The young women's tune is thus resonant with the pastoral mode embodied by the opening melody. In Block 11, the harmony layer continues as before, with the four-note motto centered on E-flat, B-flat, and various CG-oriented components. But instead of the young women's melody, we get a transposed restatement of the old women's melody. As usual, it descends within a tritone frame, articulated as 036, although with at least a hint of 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 0246. And also, as usual, it describes a triple hypermeter. In the Nijinsky choreography, as recreated by Hodson, the old woman exits at this point. We never see her again, and we never hear her tune again. This transposition of the old woman's tune lies along the descending 3 cycle that the previous transpositions also inhabit, going back to early in the introduction to Part 1. Although we are already well into the second section of the scene, with a lengthy statement of the young women's tune amid gently oscillating harmonies, Block 12 is the moment when, according to the directions in the score, the young women actually enter. According to Robert Kraft, quote, "The dancers, young females of a primitive tribe, are demi-savages, and their dance is a celebration of puberty," close quote. The harmony layer continues from blocks 9 through 11, including one strand oriented toward E-flat, B-flat, consisting of the four-note ostinato motto, and another strand oriented toward C-G. The young women's tune is transposed up a minor third, changing its orientation from C-G to E-flat, B-flat. It is scored for solo alto flute, returning us in expressive mode to the feminized pastoral of the introduction to Part 1. The T3 that connects them is motivic, the main motive of Part 1, in fact. In this case, T3 brings the melody into conformity with the pitch level of the four-note motto ostinato. Both span E-flat, B-flat, and the melody can be heard as embedding the motto D-flat, B-flat, E-flat, B-flat. The transposition might be interpreted dramatically in 2 slightly different ways. Either the feminine young women's melody has been subsumed into the young men's motto, forced to conform, or we are witnessing a harmonious reconciliation of tune and motto. The melody is arranged with reference to a simple 4-bar hypermeasure with a slight extension via insertion in one measure, which I've notated as 3/4. But the level of internal repetition makes the situation a bit murkier, as repeated figures are moved around in relation to the bar lines, both metric and hypermetric. This final section is simultaneously a climax of Augurs of Spring, brought about by the accumulation of textural layers, and a transition to the wild, violent following scene, the ritual of abduction. Amid the climactic accumulation, The harmony is actually simplified, mostly diatonic and without the sharp clashes and dissonant distractors of the scene's opening, and the rhythm continues its steady 2/4 and, for the most part, its regular 4-beat hypermeasures. While the first section focused on the young men and the second section focused on the young women, this final section has the young men and women dancing together in a mostly harmonious way. In Block 13, the texture thickens even as the harmonic focus thins. All of the layers are now oriented toward E-flat, B-flat, and toward the E-flat minor triad within an entirely diatonic E-flat Dorian collection. The C-oriented material, which had prevailed throughout the second section of the movement, is now gone. In the harmony layer, the ongoing 4-note motto is joined by 3 other ostinatos, all oriented toward E-flat, B-flat. In the bass, we find the 6-note bass ostinato from Block 4. Its periodicity brings it into coincidence with the other ostinatos only every third measure. That is the only metrical disruption of what is otherwise a stable, regular 4-measure phrase. The melody is again the young women's tune, now an octave higher, and in the flute, both the register and the instrument affirm that pastoral feminine identity of the tune. The melodic frame and the harmonic frame are the same, creating a relatively harmonious consonant effect and affirming the centricity of E-flat, B-flat. In Block 14, the texture continues to thicken even as the harmonic focus remains exclusively on E-flat, B-flat. In addition to the ostinatos in the harmonic layer and the young women's melody, we get an important new melody. Like the young women's melody, this new melody also unfolds within a B-flat, E-flat melodic frame filled in as a Dorian tetrachord, which it expresses as a scalar ascent, descent, and ascent. The melody is amplified with planing 6/5 chords, all drawn from the E-flat Dorian collection. Indeed, the entire block uses only those 7 notes. It is based on an 8-measure phrase divided as 2 4-measure groups, but 2 measures are deleted from the second group, and we end up with a 6-measure phrase. This new melody reappears later as the principal melody in the 4th scene of the ballet, Spring Rounds. In Spring Rounds, this melody is marked sostenuto e pesante and forms part of what is apparently a stately, solemn religious procession. In Augurs, however, the melody emerges within a celebratory dance of the young people. Its association with the religious mode is latent here, to be realized fully later. Block 15 is very much a continuation of Block 14, with all strands of the thickening texture referable to the E-flat, B-flat frame. The young women's melody and the Spring Rounds melody continue, as do all of the ostinato strands within the harmony layer. Ribbons of E-flat Dorian scales are now continuous, and a new 4-note ostinato in the piccolo affirms the centrality of E-flat, B-flat. A sustained low G in French horns 3 and 4 conflicts with G-flat in the upper voices, adding this sharp dissonance to the general cacophony. The 2 principal melodies in the block, the young women's melody and the Spring Rounds melody, both involve shuffling around of the melodic cells that compose them. Each transforms a relatively simple implicit metrical prototype, but the elisions and extensions within each melody guarantee that they rarely coincide. The young women's melody is roughly 7 hypermeasures of 4/4, divided as 3 plus 4, but with the elisions and extensions. Here's the melody with its little cells marked. And here's a rhythmic reduction of the melody. The spring rounds melody is roughly 3 measures of 4/2, but also with the elisions and extensions. Here is that melody with its cells marked. And here is a reduction of that melody. Each melody goes its own way, although their mutual traversal of the same melodic frame, B flat C, D flat, E flat, produces little in the way of sharp conflict between them. In Block 16, the melodies from Blocks 13 through 15 suddenly drop out, and no new melody arrives. Instead, this block consists entirely of a harmonic layer with multiple strands, a thick accompaniment with no melody to accompany. Despite its textual complexity and density and its growing sense of frenzy, this block is a simple 8-measure phrase. Among these strands, the 4-note motto and the bass ostinato remain from the previous blocks. To these existing strands, Block 16 adds new ostinato strands, tritone-related Dorian tetrachords in the first violins and arpeggiated diminished triads in the second violins. The diminished seventh chords formed between the strands are emphasized by offbeat chords in winds and strings. These are all within Oct 1-2, while the ostinatos in the lower strings, continuing from previous blocks, are basically diatonic within E-flat mixolydian. The patterned, repeated cyclic melodic activity creates whole tone harmonies vertically. As we will see at the end of Part 1 in the Dance of the Earth, and Part 2, the Sacrificial Dance, wild dances in the Rite of Spring have a strongly whole tone aspect. The wild ending of the Augurs of Spring prefigures these more fully realized orgiastic dances of life and death. Let's listen strand by strand. From the dense chromatic intensity of Block 16, we move to a greatly simplified and almost purely diatonic 8-measure Block 17. The 3-flat key signature and the long-term harmonic focus on E-flat, B-flat are suddenly gone, and we find ourselves in a white note G mixolydian world. Until this point in the scene, the 4-note motto ostinato was omnipresent and fixed in its pitch position, D-flat, B-flat, E-flat, B-flat. In Block 17, the motto remains, but it has been transposed down a semitone. This move recalls the introduction in 2 ways. First, the introduction also ended with its opening music transposed down a semitone. Second, this transposition returns us to the level of the opening of the introduction, where the initial tune featured a descending minor third, C-A, with D as upper neighbor to C. There is thus a larger symmetry that binds the introduction to the Augurs of Spring. T-1 takes the music away from its starting point in the introduction and back to its starting point in the Augurs of Spring. At the same time, the young women's tune is also transposed down a semitone in this block and also returns to the pitch level of the opening of the ballet. In contrast to the transposed and now DA-focused melody and four-note ostinato, the remaining strands of the harmonic layer are oriented toward GD. Within the prevailing diatonic G Mixolydian collection, then, we have a mild conflict of melodies mostly centered on DA and harmonies mostly centered on GD, creating a relatively harmonious environment for the women and men dancing together. The scene concludes with three more 8-measure blocks. I'm treating them as a single unit because their contents are virtually identical and the breaks between them are not pronounced. The transposed young women's melody and the transposed four-note motto continue from the previous block, both still within a DA frame. The young women's melody continues to project a reasonably regular 4-bar hypermeasure. The textural accumulation creates a sense of frenetic activity, but the meter is a steady 2/4 throughout the scene, and the scene's principal melody is mostly arranged in regular 4-measure groups, despite the frequent repetition and shuffling of its constituent melodic cells. There is a larger expressive point here. The normal human characters, the young men and the young women, despite their youthful exuberance and the excitement of springtime and the attractions and dangers of men and women dancing together, generally conform their musical behavior to long-established norms for phrase and hypermeter. harmony layer consists of three strands: an ostinato in the bass that establishes F as the central tone, embellished with upper and lower neighbors, an oscillation of seventh chords, a scale that runs up an octave, A, B, C, D, E flat, F, G, A, which is encrusted with parallel planing by thirds, triads, or seventh chords. All of the strands conform to that nearly diatonic scale, and all can be heard as oriented toward F as a central tone and toward FC as a harmonic focus. The scene as a whole is mostly centered on E flat. This shift at the end up a whole step to F adds to the excitement of the melodic accumulation and opens the gateway to the next scene.